Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's National NAGPRA Program webinar. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I'm the manager of the National NAGPRA Program. This is the last and final webinar in the series of webinars for today. For this year. I am trying to do too many things at once. Let me share my screen. There we go. We have hosted 9 other webinars this year, starting in January. Each of those webinars is available on our events page. You can go back and watch any of the webinar recordings. You can also access some of the slides from those webinars or other related documents. So this is the last and final webinar in this series, and today's webinar will cover the review committee. I want to remind everyone that we do intend to produce a similar series of webinars starting again in January of 2025. And if you have topics or ideas that you would like to see addressed in these webinars, you're welcome to send us that suggestion at nagpra_info@nps.gov. So today's webinar is going to focus on the NAGPRA Review Committee. And similar to last month's webinar, I want to use available resources, resources you can find on the internet about the Review Committee to provide the content for today's webinar. As with other webinars, we have turned off the chat and the Q&A is turned off for now. We will turn on the Q&A later, and there'll be plenty of times for questions and responses at the end of the session. So if you have questions as we go along, please make note of them and raise them at the end of the session today. So I wanted to start today's webinar by looking at what the law itself includes related to the review committee. So what you're seeing on the screen, hopefully you're seeing on the screen, is section 3006 of NAGPRA. Again, you can find this on our website under Law and Policy, a direct link to this version of the law. This comes from the U.S. the U.S. Code online, sort of the official version of the law that's available online. Interestingly enough, for those of you who are interested in NAGPRA and generally, this is the longest part of the law. The most words are here in the review committee section. The other parts of the law, the sections on inventories and summaries, repatriation, are much shorter. The only longer section in the law itself is the definition section by word count. But this is where the most words and really the most direction from Congress is provided here in this section on the review committee. So you can see that this section of the law talks about first the establishment of a committee, second the membership of this committee, the responsibilities of the committee, and then additional information about the committee, in particular related to admissibility of records or findings from the committee, recommendations that the committee might make, as well as the responsibilities of the Secretary of the Interior for the committee. And also at the very end, the requirement for the committee to produce annual reports to Congress. So we're going to dig into each of these subjects a little bit more, but I again wanted to start with the law because so much of what the review committee does and is comprised of is provided here in the law itself. In addition to the law, of course, we have the regulations, and the revised regulations at 10.12, in fact, the entire Subpart D of the regulations cover the review committee. And as is typical for regulations, the regulations expand on and provide additional information from what is in the law itself. So you will see only 3 sections here of additional information provided in the regulations about recommendations from the committee, some additional membership information through the nomination process. And then the largest section of this part of the regulations is related to findings of fact or disputes on repatriation. So I'm going to kind of jump around between the law, the regulations, and additional information about each of these topics. And I want to also refer you to another document that's helpful in understanding the review committee and its authority, and that is the review committee's charter. So the charter is issued by the Secretary of the Interior and is renewed every 2 years. And really provides a lot of the same information you can find in the law itself related to the duties of the committee, as well as other responsibilities for a designated federal official to the NAGPRA Review Committee. And you will see in the charter that the manager of the National NAGPRA program is designated as the federal officer to the NAGPRA Review Committee, and that's a role that I currently serve in. There are also ethics responsibilities of members that are included here in the charter, and this is the only one of the few places that you'll find that, as well as information about subcommittees and record keeping. So between these 3 things, the law itself, the regulations, and this charter, those are the sort of authoritative documents that describe what the review committee is and what they do. To walk through this, I wanted to walk through the pieces of the NAGPRA Review Committee part of our webpage. Again, this is kind of a brief summary, and it really provides the best presentation format for this information. So again, as stated in the law itself, the NAGPRA Review Committee is a federal advisory committee. Federal advisory committee is a specific type of committee that provides advice to the federal government. There are many different kinds of federal advisory committees, and the NAGPRA committee is just one of the many different federal advisory committees that exist. With some variations, there are some unique pieces of the NAGPRA Review Committee that are a little different than other federal advisory committees. But as with all federal advisory committee, there are certain rules that must be applied to the committee and to the process of the committee based on that Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, you might have heard reference to. So in general, the review committee is charged with monitoring and reviewing the implementation of NAGPRA. Members are appointed by the Secretary of the Interior, and we'll talk more about the membership and the nominations in a minute. The general responsibilities of the review committee are to monitor the NAGPRA inventory and identification process, review and make findings related to the identity or cultural affiliation of items or the return of those items, facilitating the resolution of disputes, consulting with tribes, NHOs, and museums on matters that affect tribes or organizations that are within the scope of the committee. So again, referring back to that scope of the inventory and identification process. And lastly, consulting with the Secretary of the Interior on the development of regulations to carry out NAGPRA. So again, these are the responsibilities that you can find in the law itself here under responsibilities. Some are shortened or combined, but they're generally the same list that you can find. Here is the list there on the review committee webpage about the responsibilities of the committee. So the web page further breaks down the committee through members, meetings, reports to Congress, requests and recommendations, and again, provides a copy of the charter. So let's turn first to the membership of the NAGPRA Review Committee. Jumping back to the law for a minute, you will see that here under B, the committee membership is made up of 7 members. There are 3 members who are appointed by the secretary from nominations submitted by Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and traditional Native American religious leaders. And at least 2 of those persons must be traditional Indian religious leaders. In addition to that, there are 3 members who are appointed from nominations submitted by national museum organizations and scientific organizations. And then lastly, the 7th position is 1 member who is appointed by the secretary from a list of persons developed and consented to by all the other members. So the other 6 members have a responsibility to prepare a list of persons for the secretary to make that 7th member appointment. That 7th member appointment is sometimes called the consensus member, sometimes called the at-large member, or sometimes just called the 7th member, because that nomination process is a little bit different. It's important to note that no members of the review committee can be federal employees or federal officers. And in addition to that, the secretary is responsible for filling vacancies in the same manner as the original appointment, meaning through that same nomination appointment. And members of this committee serve without pay, but are reimbursed at a daily rate, including travel time, and also receive reimbursement for travel expenses. So that's one piece that's a little different. Some federal advisory committees are not paid at all. But there is a provision here for a reimbursement for time as well as travel expenses in NAGPRA. So as I mentioned, the regulations expand a little bit on the nominations in particular, and in particular try to provide clarity around the requirement for a national museum organization or a national scientific organization to provide nominations. In the past, there's been some question or confusion about what is a national museum organization or national scientific organization. And so the regulations have tried to clarify that by providing additional information that the terms in the law itself, the National Museum Organization or National Scientific Organization, are organizations that focus on the interests of museum and science disciplines throughout the United States. That's the national part. Also that offer membership throughout the United States, although it does not need to be limited to only members in the United States, meaning it could be have international members, but the membership must be offered throughout the United States and is organized under the laws of the United States government. So that was a little bit of additional information that is in the revised regulations to help clarify that language from the Act itself. Pardon me. So in terms of who the current members are, we have a little updating here to do. As you can see that one of our committee members term ended 11 days ago, and so we need to take this appointment off, but we do keep all of the current members here on our webpage under members. So you can see that right now we have 4 members of the review committee, and we have 3 vacancies on the review committee that we are working on filling. In addition to the current members, you can look at membership history to see those who have served on the review committee in the past and under what role they served. So again, we've identified these as members 1, 2, and 3, those that are nominated by Indian tribes or NHOs, with 2 members that serve as Indian religious leaders. And then the 3 members nominated by museum and scientific organizations are here as number 4, 5, and 6. And then that 7th member, the at-large or consensus member, and the history of that membership position and who has served in that position. So we hope that this helps you find some of the historical information about the membership of the committee, as well as the current membership. As I mentioned, we do have currently 3 vacancies. 2 vacancies are those members appointed by National Museum and Scientific Organizations. We solicited nominations in May, and the deadline for submitting those nominations was in July. And we are currently waiting for an appointment from the Secretary of the Interior for those 2 vacancies. The 3rd vacancy, again, for the term that just ended this month, we did solicit nominations, but we did not receive any nominations in May and July for this position. So we will be soliciting again nominations from Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and traditional religious leaders for this position, which is a traditional Indian religious leader position. So keep your eye out for that notice. We will, of course, be posting that to our website. And please, if you are an Indian tribe or an NHO or a traditional religious leader, please make a nomination for that position. Okay, so jumping back again to the law, we have, again, in addition to the longer list of responsibilities, there is some a unique piece of the NAGPRA Review Committee, which is under the responsibilities here in the law under number 3, and that is that number 3 and 4, that the Review Committee can make findings related to the identity of cultural items or can facilitate the resolution of disputes. We have included, as I mentioned, additional information in the regulations related to findings of fact or disputes on repatriation. And we have tried to clarify in the regulations which parties can bring findings of fact or disputes before the Review Committee. And so we have provided a term affected party in the regulations to define the 2 groups that could bring a finding of fact or a dispute. An affected party for purposes of NAGPRA and for a finding of fact or dispute is either a museum or federal agency or a lineal descendant Indian tribe or NHO with potential cultural affiliation. We further explain in the regulations that the Review Committee can make advisory finding of facts related to the identity of an object, the cultural affiliation of human remains or objects or cultural items, and the repatriation of human remains or cultural items. It's important to note that in both number 2 and number 3, there's an emphasis here on the advisory finding of fact or the advisory recommendation on a dispute. And again, under number 3, a Review Committee may make an advisory recommendation on a dispute between affected parties. And to facilitate that dispute, the Review Committee can consider disputes between affected parties, so a museum and federal agency on the one hand, and an affected party on the other hand of a lineal descendant or an Indian tribe. What the Review Committee cannot do is consider disputes among an affected group. So in particular, disputes between lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and NHOs cannot be considered by the Review Committee. Likewise, disputes among museums and federal agencies cannot be considered by the Review Committee. But any dispute between those 2 affected parties could be considered. And requests for information or presentations may be from any affected party. And the Review Committee may make advisory recommendations directly to the affected parties or to the Secretary of the Interior. This emphasis on the advisory nature of either the finding of fact or the recommendations again goes back to paragraph A in the regulations, but also to the overall management of this committee as a federal advisory committee. Recommendations, findings, reports, or other actions of the review committee are advisory only and are not binding, meaning that if the review committee does hear a finding of fact or makes a recommendation to resolve a dispute, those are only advisory. They are not binding on any party, that decision. However, it is important to know that any records, including those findings made by the review committee, are admissible as evidence in actions brought by persons alleging a violation of the act, meaning they could be admissible in court as a part of a further action or litigation related to the dispute or to a finding. Findings and recommendations made by the review committee must be published in the Federal Register. This is in addition to the regulations. We've put a timeline here for publication of those findings or recommendations within 90 days of the finding or recommendation. So again, this all clarifies what is in the law itself related to the responsibilities of the review committee, but as you may have noticed also on the admissibility of records or findings. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what the review committee has done, you can see that the review committee has made recommendations on disposition under the previous regulatory framework. The review committee could make recommendations to the secretary on the disposition of culturally unidentifiable human remains. And so there is a long history of disposition recommendations the committee made. And then the committee has also made several findings of fact or recommendations on disputes. I'm going to skip the dispositions for now, although that's a valuable archive of decisions by the review committee, and share this, which is our table of the recommendations and findings of fact that have been made by the committee in its full history. And you can see that these are references to that publication in the Federal Register of those recommendations or findings. Some of the early findings are not available online in the Federal Register, so we have provided those as an uploaded document. But everything after 1994 can be accessed directly to the Federal Register publication itself. This is searchable, so if you were looking for a particular recommendation or finding of fact, you can type in the name of the museum or the tribe, and it will limit what you see here. It's important to note that while this links only to the recommendation, the final recommendation or finding, there is information here about the meeting number as well as the date, which can provide additional information about that finding or that dispute, including the transcripts of that meeting and any presentations that might have been made at that meeting. Okay, I will also mention that the review committee has, for over 10 years now, had a dispute and finding of fact procedure document, which in addition to the regulations provides additional information about the process by which any affected party might raise a finding of fact or a dispute. There is likely some updates that need to be made to this based on the revised regulations, but mostly in just the references. For the most part, these procedures are still valid and still useful and are a great document for anyone who is looking to bring a finding of a fact or a dispute to the review committee to look in more detail at the kinds of information the review committee needs and the process by which the review committee will make that finding or make a recommendation on a dispute. Heading back again to the law, we will see that here at the very bottom, there is a requirement in the law itself for the committee to submit an annual report to Congress on the progress made and any barriers encountered in implementing this section in the previous year. This is also a unique feature of the NAGPRA Review Committee. Most federal advisory committees only report to the federal agency that they are advising. But in the case of NAGPRA, Congress requested that this federal advisory committee also report annually to Congress. So we have available on our website, again, the various reports to Congress that have been submitted since 1992. You can find copies of all of those here on our website if you want to look at those reports that have been submitted to Congress. And if you have participated in the last review committee meeting, which was held just a little less than a month ago, the committee approved its report to Congress for the fiscal year 2024 at that meeting. So this is a good opportunity to switch and talk about meetings. For any of you who have not attended a NAGPRA Review Committee meeting, they are definitely worth attendance. And you can also go back and look at meeting minutes, meeting transcripts, as well as meeting materials from past meetings. And that last meeting that I mentioned on September 23rd, 2024, just a few weeks ago, was the 89th meeting of the NAGPRA Review Committee. So we have on our webpage here files for each of the previous NAGPRA Review Committee meetings. You will notice that many of these were in person prior to 2020. I think we all are aware of the circumstances that changed in our world with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we have switched to virtual meetings. We have held one in-person meeting since 2020. In 2023, there was an in-person meeting held in Bloomington, Indiana. But for the most part, meetings have been virtual since 2020. Previous to that, we did not have a virtual meeting option, but we did have telephonic meetings. And so you'll see that some of these meetings are telephonic. Again, each of these files contains minutes, transcripts, agendas, as well as meeting materials. So it's a complete archive for each of these meetings. Again, it is a requirement of FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, that each federal advisory committee have an agenda as well as minutes that are produced after the meeting. For the NAGPRA Review Committee, because of that admissibility of NAGPRA Review Committee findings or recommendations, we have also always produced transcripts for NAGPRA Review Committee meetings so that the verbatim transcript is available in cases of admissibility, but really also for more of an accurate historical archive of these meetings and of the work of the NAGPRA Review Committee. NAGPRA Review Committee meetings are governed by meeting procedures that are developed by the committee itself. What you see on the screen now are the most recent meeting procedures of the NAGPRA Review Committee. And this document basically governs how the committee functions, how it governs itself, how it selects a chair, and how members can vote, as well as other pieces of how the committee manages its meetings, including public participation. Public participation is a requirement, again, of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Every meeting of the NAGPRA Review Committee must provide an opportunity for public comment. And the NAGPRA Review Committee provides 3 ways that the public may participate in meetings. One is by requesting scheduled presentations. We often receive requests from museums, federal agencies, or tribes to make direct presentations to the NAGPRA Review Committee. And those requests should be sent to the designated federal officer or me at my office through our general website, through our general email box, which is nagpra_info@nps.gov. In addition to that, the review committee can also accept written comments, again, submitted to me ahead of the meeting in writing by email. And then lastly, our public comments. So every meeting will provide an opportunity for anyone in attendance to provide a comment to the review committee. So I wanted to point out, in addition to the meeting files that are available on our website, we also, with the virtual meetings, have been able to provide video recordings on our YouTube channel for past NAGPRA review committee meetings. And even before we went virtual, well, I guess actually no, it starts with the first Zoom meeting that we had, which was meeting 67 in 2021, that you can find a recording of those meetings available here on our YouTube channel. In addition, I wanted to highlight again that the National NAGPRA Program YouTube channel includes a NAGPRA video project. And that video project includes a 37-minute video on the NAGPRA Review Committee. These videos, I featured the grants video in the May webinar because of how relevant the information from these videos still is to today and to NAGPRA. So even with the changes in the regulations, these videos continue to be a wonderful source of information about the different aspects of NAGPRA, wonderful training resources for anyone to learn more about any part of NAGPRA. And in particular, I would recommend to you, if you're interested in learning more about the review committee, you can watch this video on the NAGPRA Review Committee, which features interviews with NAGPRA Review Committee members about their work and about the work of the committee. So they're a very valuable resource, and I want to encourage you again to make use of these videos whenever you can, in addition to looking at the actual records that are available or the recordings of the review committee meetings. I'm just going to step back to the law. I think we've covered pretty much everything: membership, responsibilities, records and findings, recommendations, as well as the report to Congress. And we've discussed the three pieces that are covered in the regulations that build on the framework provided in the Act itself. Again, much of this is repeated in the charter with some additional information about the specific work of the committee and administration of the committee, which is the responsibility of the Secretary of the Interior. And so with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If I can find the right button. But I'd be happy to provide any additional resources or information. And let me go ahead and turn on the chat. And it looks like we have quite a bit of time today for any questions that you might have with a shorter presentation. So I have opened the Q&A, excuse me, not the chat, the Q&A. You can use the Q&A button to submit a question. You can also upvote a question. So if somebody asks a question and you have the same question, you can upvote that, and that will raise it to the top of my list here. All right, so we have a couple of first of all, Lisa has provided a link to the review committee page on our website. Thank you, Lisa. You should be able to see that under answered questions. The next question is, I am an anthropology student who is interested in NAGPRA. Are there any official ways to be trained or certified? Thank you for the question. There are lots of ways to be trained, and there's so much information available. But there's not any official method, at least not through our office, through the National NAGPRA program, to be trained or certified. I will say that there are plenty of academic programs that relate to NAGPRA, some that are specific to NAGPRA, and you might want to look into those options, but there's nothing connected to our office in terms of any kind of official training or certification. But again, we have so many resources available that anyone can learn more about NAGPRA. All right, a question, are electronic signatures obtained through software like DocuSign acceptable on NAGPRA documents? This is a great question, and it refers to, actually the answer is in the regulations, in that written documents must be submitted in certain ways, including by email, but there is no regulatory requirement for electronic signatures. So the answer to your question is there's actually no requirement for an electronic signature. So there's no requirement to use software like DocuSign for signatures on NAGPRA documents. What is required is that documents be submitted in writing, which can include email, and that when documents are submitted, that there's a verification of receipt of that document. We've talked about this in other webinars, but verifying receipt or proof of receipt could be achieved electronically through a read receipt function that your email might have, or it could also be achieved by asking somebody to confirm receipt of the document by email. Could also be confirmed by a follow-up phone call to say, did you receive my document? And then write down the phone call and that it was received. Those are all acceptable ways of achieving a return receipt. So hopefully that answers your question. There is no electronic signature requirement in NAGPRA, and whatever system or software that a museum or a tribe might have and be using to provide documents with signatures is acceptable. Okay. All right, thank you so much, Katie, for sharing with Kay a link to previous recordings. You can find previous recordings of these webinars on our events page. You can go to nps.gov/NAGPRA, which is the homepage of the National Park Service NAGPRA website. And if you scroll to the bottom of that page, you'll see at the bottom an events, a box for the events. And you can click on that and it'll take you right to that events page. But you can also use the URL that Katie provided. Thank you again. All right. Can a state tribe present to the review committee in those instances where there is a competing claim? Thank you for the question. In the regulations, an affected party is limited to a lineal descendant Indian tribe, which means a federally recognized tribe, or a Native Hawaiian organization. So in those terms, a state recognized tribe that is not federally recognized would not be an affected party and could not then bring a dispute to the review committee. And again, disputes among tribes would not be something that the review committee could hear. The review committee is available to hear disputes or disagreements between museums on federal agencies on the one hand and lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs on the other hand. Where there is conflict between tribes or between a state recognized tribe and a federally recognized tribe, those would not fall under the purview of the NAGPRA review committee. All right. I manage a repository connected to a university. While preparing my summary and inventory, do I need to ask faculty of the university to provide information on any materials that they might have? If so, what are ways to explain the importance to reluctant faculty? So I think that there are two things here. I'm going to unpack this question a little bit. Do you need to ask university faculty to provide information about collections? Yes, you have an obligation as the university to gather information about the collection. So where a faculty member might have field notes or other documents that relate to the collection, you have an obligation to ensure you're collecting all of that available information that the university has related to your collection. The other side of this question might be, are you required to ask faculty about materials that they have, about collections that the faculty might have? And the answer there again is going to be yes. The obligation to comply with NAGPRA is on the university. It is the university's responsibility to ensure that it is complying with NAGPRA. And so how it goes about that, how it goes about ensuring that all faculty that have collections and that have information are providing that to the university representative is really important to consider, but NAGPRA is not going to tell you how to do it necessarily, but NAGPRA does require that the university do so. In terms of ways that you might explain the importance of this to reluctant faculty, I would highly recommend that you ask that question of the NAGPRA community of practice, as you'll probably get a lot of advice from people who have been in similar circumstances, who have made, who might have some ideas for you about how to persuade or explain. I will say that again, it is the university's responsibility. And so many universities, NAGPRA compliance is a part of other compliance responsibilities within the organization of the university. So sometimes we see the NAGPRA compliance office being attached to risk management and compliance that the university has writ large, sometimes attached to a provost or a president's office, because again of that wide responsibility that the university has for the compliance. So my recommendation to you would be to seek support from within the administration of the university for the effort that you're undertaking, because it is an obligation for the university to ensure that it is reporting everything and that it is gathering all available information. All right, let me resort. All right. There we go. All right, for missing ancestors and AFOs, what is the agency museums responsible for? In regards to finding the missing individuals or items, as well as should they never be found? This is a good question, and can be a challenging one to answer, and mostly because there are lots of different circumstances. However, the responsibility for a federal agency or a museum is to identify all human remains and cultural items based on available information. So that could mean that if a catalog record or an accession record indicates that there were ancestors or AFOs or other cultural items, but they cannot be physically located, that information still needs to be provided as a part of the NAGPRA process. So where there's a record to indicate the existence of ancestors or objects, you do have an obligation to ensure you're including that information in your reporting. And again, including the maybe identification that it's currently missing or the physical object could not be located. And in regard to finding the missing individuals or items, or maybe that question here is, what's the obligation to go find them? Well, it's the same obligation that you have for anything in your care or your collection, which is a due diligence requirement to see if you can identify those objects or ancestors. Certainly have an obligation to report them. You have an obligation to transfer them if they are found. Beyond that, I think that this, if you have some specific questions that relate to more particular circumstances, we might be able to help address that on a one-to-one basis. But I'll give you a couple of scenarios that I can come up with. So say a museum has a large collection, has a catalog record that says this box should exist and it should contain ancestors and funerary objects. But when you go to the shelf, you can't find it. That's a pretty common circumstance. So in that case, you would want to be sure that you're still including those ancestors and objects in your inventory, that you're consulting on those, and that you're disclosing that you cannot find them. If they are found at some point, then the NAGPRA process is already underway and you've completed your obligations to report them. And that could include publishing them in a notice of inventory completion for ancestors and funerary objects. If you look, we have several examples of museums where they may have misplaced some funerary objects, but they are aware of that they exist or it did exist, and they have gone ahead and included those in their notice of inventory completion. This is going to, again, depend on some of the circumstances around what's missing. I would also say that it's really important to understand whether something is missing, meaning that it's lost, or if there's some information to show that this item was removed or transferred, or in the worst cases, stolen. So you really do need to make an effort to identify as much as you can about what is missing, so that you can decide on what the best course is. Please keep in mind that many collections were traded and transferred over time. And so the other thing that you would want to do is be sure that you have no indication of what might have happened to those ancestors or to those items. Okay. Let's see. The next upvoted question is, do NAGPRA laws and regulations require consent before exhibiting Native American artifacts? Does it apply to projectile points and other stone tools from the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, or Woodland period? And thankfully, Stephen Simpson, also with the Department of the Interior, has provided a helpful answer here that the regulations apply to cultural items that are defined by NAGPRA. And whether such points or tools are NAGPRA cultural items, meaning funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony, is up to the museum to determine in consultation with tribes and with deference to Native American traditional knowledge. So, again, we can't answer for the specific objects, but what the answer is, the museum must make that decision about whether they are NAGPRA cultural items and should do so in consultation. All right. Let me do another sort here. Can a NAGPRA grant be utilized for reburial location improvements, such as erosion concerns, control, so that the ancestor is protected? Thanks for the question. This is an interesting one. NAGPRA repatriation grants can be used to conduct a reburial. But a NAGPRA repatriation grant could not be used to protect a burial that is already in place. You would need to look at other grant programs that might be able to support protection of a burial site or a burial location for erosion or other issues, so that the burial site remains intact. If you are if you work for a tribe, I would highly recommend you look into tribal heritage grants. through the Historic Preservation Fund grant programs, again, through the National Park Service. But there might be other preservation grant funds that could assist with the protection of burials, but not a NAGPRA grant. Okay, just a note that the committee's annual report to Congress for FY24 is posted in the meeting materials for the September 23rd meeting, but is not yet available on the reports to Congress page. So, and then I'll link to where you can access that report. And all right. The next one is a little off topic, but any advice on how to resolve the conflict between Section 106 investigations to determine eligibility and tribal requests to not collect items and not to dig without consultation? A good question, somewhat related, I guess, maybe to that protection of burials question that we just received. I would say that my advice is really to go back to what the 106 requirement is here, and maybe also if you do work for a tribe, to seek some advice or support from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation about those requirements of a 106 investigation that your question indicates requires some ground disturbance or collection in order to determine eligibility. And again, the focus here today is NAGPRA, and I appreciate that you said this was a little off topic. But I think that asking some questions about what investigation is required by 106 is pretty important, even at the eligibility stage. And there might be that the ACHP can be helpful here. I would also recommend, as it relates to human remains and burial sites, the ACHP, sorry, for those of you who aren't familiar with that acronym, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has recently released policy and guidance on the treatment of burials and human remains in particular, and the requirements for consultation, as well as protection of those sites. So those would be my two recommendations to you. Okay, the next question is, in emphasizing the importance of complying with NAGPRA, what consequences exist for agencies and organizations that do not comply? Thanks again to Stephen Simpson with the Department of the Interior for answering this in the Q&A. There are civil penalties under NAGPRA and for museums. So allegation of failure to comply might be one avenue of a consequence. In addition to that, of course, lawsuits might be another way to challenge or to force compliance. And the follow-up question to that, is it possible to know how often lawsuits are filed for this? Does the threat have teeth? I don't have a clear sense, but I am, some legal research would give you the lawsuits and the frequency of which they are filed. I think that questions of compliance and whether lawsuits are outside the purview of really my job and this webinar, but I think in terms of whether that option to litigate has teeth, I think there are certainly risks involved in seeking a remedy through a lawsuit. However, again, those are options for the consequences for not complying. I will add that for federal agencies, in addition to a lawsuit, there might be other avenues for investigations or inquiries into the work of the federal government, and that would usually be by seeking, making a allegation or an accusation to the Inspector General for that federal agency or to some other investigative body for a specific federal agency. Okay, a question related to the topic for today. How does the finding of fact by the review committee process look like? How evidentiary documents are produced, and how long does it on average take for the procedure until finding of fact is completed and published? Great question, and I would highly recommend that you take a look at past findings on our website to answer both of those questions, because I think that's going to give you the best sense for what kind of documents are provided in a finding of fact and how long the process takes. The most recent finding of fact, I'm probably going to get the date wrong, so I'm going to look it up so I don't get the date wrong. Excuse me. Let me find the right page of the website, because I really, sometimes time gets away from you. So in November of 2021, the review committee heard a request from several Indian tribes, starting with the Choctaw Nation and including the Chickasaw Nation, the Coshada tribe of Louisiana, and many others, is a joint finding of fact request. That finding of fact decision was published in the Federal Register in February of 2022, so a few months later. And in general, so just to speak in general terms, the documents that are required for a finding of fact are really the records that are available, the information that's available. So the documents that are available, say, to a museum or to a federal agency that is making a decision on cultural affiliation or on the identity of an object, would be the kind of documents that you would want to bring to a review committee to make a finding of fact. Now, let me step back and say that the review committee finding of fact process is going to be about a decision under NAGPRA. So again, about cultural affiliation of an object, about the identity of an object, so as an object of cultural patrimony or a sacred object. Those are findings of fact that the review committee's heard many times, and we have many examples of those different kinds of findings. I would encourage you to look through some of the Federal Register publications to see what might better match your circumstances, and then dig a little deeper into the meeting materials to see what kinds of documents were submitted, because I think that's going to be the best way to answer this question. In terms of how long does it take? So for a finding of fact, you would need to make the request to the review committee, and that would start by sending the request to me. It can move pretty quickly, provided you have all of the documents together. Sometimes we see the delay in a finding of fact come from the need to find additional documents, or the need to pull together additional information that gives the review committee enough to make a finding. So that really, kind of depends on where you're starting with in terms of whether you have sufficient documentation to start with. But generally it can move very quickly then, depending on when the next review committee meeting is scheduled. The review committee will generally hear a presentation on a finding of fact and make a recommendation in that same meeting. And then the finding of fact would be published within 90 days of that recommendation. So hopefully that helps answer your question. And of course, my office is happy to talk to you more about a specific case or specific issue to help you figure out what kinds of documents might be needed. Thank you, Stephen, for including that link to the 2022 finding of fact. All right, and we've got one more question here, which is, are there resources or recommendations on how to encourage reluctant board members to not be fearful of rightful justified return under NAGPRA beyond the threat of legal consequences? Yeah, this is a good question. obviously, threats can only work so well, and sometimes there is a need for more of a persuasion effort. I would highly recommend showing some of the NAGPRA videos, and in particular, the video on the development of NAGPRA, or the other video called NAGPRA. Those are two videos that really talk generally about why NAGPRA was necessary, the history of excavation and treatment of Native Americans in this country, and why that resulted in the need for NAGPRA in the first place. And those are very persuasive. I think they're persuasive as well because they often feature interviews from Native Americans about what repatriation means to them and to their tribes. And those can be very persuasive. I think some of the persuasion comes from really looking at how the institutions, the museum, the university, acquired those objects, can lead to a better result in persuading a board member of the need to return those objects. I think there are other examples that you could look to as well for the persuasive issue that are outside of the Native American context. Certainly there is, a large effort to identify Holocaust art and to return that. That's a, kind of parallel that you could make. Certainly there are other repatriations in material that's been collected around the world, again, outside of the NAGPRA responsibility, in the Native American context in particular, and those might be persuasive. I think that in addition to that, there's some, general museum ethics that would compel the justification of a return, even if it's beyond just the legal requirements of NAGPRA. Those are all the questions that we have today so far. Give you one more opportunity to ask, to post a question in the Q&A. I hope that you have found these webinars to be helpful and to provide an opportunity to ask your questions. Again, we intend to continue these webinar series next year, and we hope that you will join us again starting in January. Just a last thank you is the last item that I see here. And lots of clapping, so thank you very much. I really appreciate that. If you do have a question, you can add it in the Q&A. And again, I'll just encourage you to continue your efforts to learn more about NAGPRA through all the resources that we've made available, including these webinars. Will an invite for next year be emailed? We'll do the same. We'll set up a registration, and you just register once, and then it'll notify you every month that there is an upcoming webinar, but you will need to register. I think I'll have to restart this webinar series in the new year. So please look for a registration link again on our website. Well, thank you all very much for your time today. Oh, well, I got a last question here. I'll just go ahead and ask it. How might the National NAGPRA Program Office support a federal agency when the federal agency has competing claims to a particular NAGPRA object? Well, whether you're a federal agency or a museum, we can talk you through the regulatory requirements for identifying who has priority when there are competing requests or competing claims. We have tried very hard in the regulations to give you guidance, you federal agency or museum, about how to evaluate those competing requests or competing claims, and to identify who the most appropriate claimant or requester is, if you're able to do so. So we would be happy to talk you through a particular circumstance and talk through, but again, I'm going to first refer you to the guidance that's in the regulations about evaluating competing requests or evaluating competing claims. And if that doesn't get you where you need to, feel free to reach out to our office and we'd be happy to talk it through. All right, thank you all, and no problem about the late question. Have a wonderful weekend.